Some of you came here tonight with storms raging inside your chest. Your mind has been racing, your heart has been heavy, and peace feels like something distant, almost unreachable. But I need you to hear this clearly. The peace of God is not fragile, and it is not reserved for a few chosen people. The peace of God is a force, powerful, supernatural, and available to you right now. And tonight, through this atomic prayer, we are about to shift the atmosphere around your life. There are battles that cannot be solved by logic, conversations, or human strength. Some storms require spiritual authority. When anxiety whispers, when fear tries to grip your heart, and when the weight of life presses down on your soul, that is when you must rise up in prayer. Because prayer is not a weak response. It is divine strategy. And when we pray with faith, heaven responds, chains break, and the peace of God begins to flood every corner of your heart and mind. I believe someone listening to this right now has been carrying worry for far too long. You've been overthinking, losing sleep, and asking God, when will this calm down? But hear this prophetic declaration: the storm is not the end of your story. God is about to quiet the noise in your mind and settle the chaos in your spirit. As we enter this moment of prayer, something is about to shift in your atmosphere, and the peace of God will begin to rest upon you. Before we go any further, I want you to participate in this moment of faith. Go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel for daily prayers that strengthen your spirit. And in the comments right now, type S, Amen, as a declaration that you are receiving God's peace today. Also, I want you to comment one thing you're believing God for today, because we are standing in faith together and believing for breakthroughs. Now prepare your heart, because we are about to step into a powerful moment of prayer. Whatever anxiety has been trying to control you, whatever fear has been whispering lies to your mind, it must bow to the authority of God. Tonight, we are releasing atomic prayer into the atmosphere, and the peace of God, deep, unshakable, supernatural peace, is about to settle over your life like never before. Beloved, there are moments in life when the heart becomes a battlefield. The mind runs in circles, thoughts begin to multiply, and emotions feel like waves crashing against the shore of your soul. Many people know this feeling, the quiet tension that sits in the chest, the heaviness that makes breathing feel deeper than usual, the silent question that whispers, how do I find peace again? In those moments, many search for relief in distractions, in conversations, in temporary solutions. But there is a peace that does not come from circumstances improving. There is a peace that does not depend on the storm ending. The peace of God is not merely a feeling that comes and goes. It is a supernatural force released into the life of those who trust Him. The world defines peace as the absence of trouble. If everything is calm, if problems are solved, if situations are controlled, then people say they have peace. But the peace of God operates on a completely different level. God's peace can exist right in the middle of uncertainty. It can rest on your heart while challenges still surround you. It can steady your breathing while the world around you feels unstable. This is why Scripture tells us that the peace of God surpasses all understanding. It goes beyond logic. It transcends explanation. It does not make sense to the natural mind because it does not originate from the natural realm. When God releases His peace into your spirit, it is not passive. It is active. It moves through your mind like a gentle but powerful current, quieting every voice that tries to create fear. Imagine the noise of worry as a crowded room filled with anxious conversations. Thoughts speaking over each other, questions repeating themselves, memories replaying painful scenarios. But when the peace of God enters that room, something remarkable begins to happen. One by one, those voices begin to quiet down. The tension begins to loosen. The mind begins to breathe again. Many people misunderstand spiritual peace. They think peace means they will never face difficulty. But peace is not the absence of pressure. It is the presence of God within the pressure. It is knowing that even when answers are not visible, God's hand is still guiding your path. It is the assurance that you are not walking through life alone. And when that realization settles deep within your spirit, it changes the way you respond to every situation. There's a reason anxiety tries so hard to occupy your mind. Anxiety thrives on uncertainty. And the enemy knows that if your thoughts remain trapped in fear, your vision becomes clouded. Your decisions become rushed. Your heart becomes heavy. But when the peace of God enters your life, it interrupts that cycle. It reminds your spirit that God is greater than the situation you are facing. It reminds your heart that the same God who carried you yesterday is still faithful today. Think about the moments in your life when you felt overwhelmed. Perhaps it was a season when responsibilities felt too heavy, when answers seemed far away, when your mind refused to slow down even during the quiet hours of the night. Maybe you tried to reason your way out of the pressure, searching for solutions, trying to organize every possibility. But the deeper truth is this: peace does not come from having every answer. Peace comes from trusting the one who already sees the outcome. When the peace of God begins to fill your heart, something shifts inside you. The racing thoughts begin to slow. The tightness in your chest begins to loosen. The weight that once felt unbearable starts to lift. It may not happen through loud moments or dramatic changes. Sometimes the peace of God arrives like a quiet sunrise, gradually illuminating the darkness that surrounded your thoughts. The mind is a powerful space. It holds memories, hopes, fears, and expectations. But when the mind is left unguarded, it can become overwhelmed by voices that were never meant to control you. Thoughts of worry may begin as small whispers, but if they remain unchecked, they grow louder with every passing moment. This is why the peace of God is so essential. It acts like a divine guard standing at the door of your heart and mind. Imagine a protective presence surrounding your thoughts, gently redirecting anything that tries to disturb your spirit. When fear approaches, the peace of God stands firm. When worry begins to rise, that peace steadies your emotions. When uncertainty tries to convince you that everything is falling apart, the peace of God reminds you that heaven is still in control. Peace is not weakness. It is strength wrapped in calmness. It is the quiet confidence that refuses to be shaken by circumstances. When you walk in God's peace, you do not ignore reality, but you refuse to allow fear to define it. You recognize that every challenge is temporary, but God's presence is eternal. There is something powerful about a heart that rests in divine peace. Such a heart does not panic easily. It does not crumble when unexpected news arrives. It does not rush into despair when situations become complicated. Instead, it remains steady. It breathes slowly. It listens for God's direction rather than reacting to fear. Sometimes people believe they must earn God's peace by proving their strength or by having perfect faith. But peace is not a reward for perfection. It is a gift given to those who bring their burdens before God. You do not have to carry every worry by yourself. You were never designed to hold the weight of the world on your shoulders. When you release your concerns to God, something sacred begins to happen. The burden that once sat heavily on your heart begins to transfer into God's hands. Your spirit begins to feel lighter. Your thoughts begin to settle. And even if the situation around you has not yet changed, something within you has already shifted. Consider how the ocean behaves during a storm. The surface may be filled with crashing waves, but deep beneath the surface there is stillness. The deeper you go, the calmer the water becomes. In many ways, God's peace functions like those deeper waters. Life may still bring moments of turbulence, but when your spirit is anchored in God's presence, you begin to live from that deeper place of calm. It is possible to stand in the middle of life's chaos and still feel a quiet strength within your soul. That strength is not self-generated. It flows from the presence of God resting upon your life. It reminds you that storms do not last forever. It whispers to your heart that every difficult chapter eventually turns into a testimony. The supernatural nature of God's peace means it can reach places within you that human solutions cannot touch. Conversations may encourage you. Advice may guide you, but there are moments when the soul requires something deeper than words. In those moments, the presence of God gently fills the spaces where worry once lived. Peace begins to restore what anxiety tried to drain. Your breathing becomes steady. Your thoughts regain clarity. Your heart begins to trust again. The heaviness that once followed you through every moment slowly dissolves in the presence of God. It is important to understand that receiving God's peace is not about pretending everything is perfect. Faith does not require denial. Faith simply chooses to believe that God's power is greater than the problem. It chooses to believe that even when the path ahead looks uncertain, God is still guiding every step. When the peace of God surrounds your life, your perspective changes. Instead of asking, "What if everything goes wrong?" your heart begins to ask, "What if God is already working behind the scenes?" Instead of expecting failure, your spirit begins to anticipate divine intervention. This transformation often begins quietly. A single prayer spoken with sincerity, a moment of stillness where you pause long enough to breathe deeply and remember that God is near. In that moment, your spirit becomes open to receive what heaven is ready to release. The peace of God is not fragile. It does not break easily. It is resilient, steady, and deeply rooted in the character of God himself. That means your peace does not depend on the reliability of circumstances. It depends on the reliability of God. And God has never failed to sustain those who trust him. Imagine waking each day with a calm heart instead of a restless mind. Imagine walking through responsibilities without the constant pressure of fear whispering in the background. Imagine approaching challenges with steady confidence, knowing that God's presence goes before you. This is the life God desires for you, not a life free from responsibility or growth, but a life anchored in peace. A life where your heart remains steady even when situations require courage. A life where your thoughts are guided by faith rather than controlled by fear. Every time you choose to trust God instead of surrendering to anxiety, you are opening the door for that supernatural peace to flow more freely into your life. Every time you pause to pray instead of rushing into panic, you are allowing heaven to fill your spirit with calmness. Peace begins to shape the atmosphere around you. People notice it in the way you respond to challenges. They see it in the steadiness of your voice. They sense it in the calmness that surrounds your presence. Because when God's peace rests upon a person, it becomes more than a personal experience. It becomes a testimony. Others begin to ask how you remain calm during difficult seasons. They wonder how your heart stays steady when circumstances appear uncertain. And the answer is simple yet powerful. The peace you carry does not come from the world. It comes from God. And because it comes from God, it cannot be easily taken away. It is not dependent on good days or favorable outcomes. It flows from a source that never runs dry. So even when life presents moments that feel overwhelming, remember this truth. The peace of God is not distant. It is not reserved for a select few. It is available to every heart willing to receive it. It is a divine force that moves through the soul, calming the storms within, restoring strength to weary hearts, and reminding every believer that God's presence is closer than they ever realized. There are moments when fear begins quietly. It does not always arrive with loud alarms or dramatic events. Sometimes it starts with a single thought, a small concern that drifts through the mind, a question about tomorrow, a worry about a situation, a memory of something painful that once happened. At first it seems harmless, but if that thought is allowed to linger without being challenged, it begins to grow. One thought becomes another, and before long the mind feels crowded with possibilities, questions, and what-ifs that seem impossible to silence. Anxiety has a way of convincing the heart that everything must be solved immediately. It whispers that if you do not control every detail, something will go wrong. It pushes the mind to keep searching for answers even when rest is needed. And slowly, without even noticing it, the soul begins to carry a weight it was never meant to carry. But prayer changes that atmosphere. Prayer is not merely a religious habit or a routine of words spoken into the air. Prayer is a spiritual exchange. It is the sacred moment when the burdens of the human heart are placed into the hands of a faithful God. When you pray, you are not just expressing emotions. You are transferring weight. You are allowing heaven to carry what once felt too heavy for your spirit. Think about how the body reacts when anxiety fills the mind. Breathing becomes shallow, the chest tightens, sleep becomes restless. Even moments of quiet feel uncomfortable because the mind refuses to slow down. Anxiety has a way of creating tension that travels through every part of the body and spirit. But when prayer enters that moment, something gentle yet powerful begins to happen. Prayer invites the presence of God into the very place where fear has been trying to live. And the presence of God has a way of calming what anxiety has disturbed. You may not see the change instantly with your eyes, but you begin to feel it within your spirit. The racing thoughts begin to slow down. The heart begins to settle. The mind begins to release its grip on every question it once tried to control. Prayer reminds the soul that it does not have to solve life alone. There is something deeply healing about speaking honestly with God. Not polished words, not perfect sentences, just the sincere expression of a heart that is searching for peace. When you bring your worries before God, you are acknowledging that His wisdom is greater than your understanding. You are declaring that His strength is greater than your weakness. This act of surrender may feel small in the moment, but in the spiritual realm it carries enormous power. Because surrender is the doorway through which divine peace enters the heart. Anxiety often tries to convince you that you must hold everything together by yourself. It tells you that if you relax your grip, everything will fall apart. But prayer gently reminds you of a different truth. God is already holding what you cannot. Imagine a child walking beside a loving parent through a crowded place. The child does not need to understand every direction or anticipate every obstacle. The child simply holds the parent's hand and trusts that the path ahead is being guided with care. That simple trust creates peace within the child's heart. Prayer allows your soul to take hold of God's hand in the same way. It reminds you that the journey ahead does not depend solely on your strength or your understanding. It depends on the faithfulness of the one who walks beside you. Fear loses its power when it is brought into the presence of God. What once felt overwhelming begins to appear smaller in the light of divine truth. The mind begins to realize that many of the things it feared were never as powerful as they seemed. Anxiety thrives in silence, in the hidden corners of the mind where worries repeat themselves without interruption. But prayer interrupts that cycle. It brings those hidden fears into a place where they can be released. When you pray, you give voice to the burdens that once felt trapped within your thoughts. And in doing so, you begin to loosen the grip those fears once had over your heart. There is something sacred about the moment when a person pauses, closes their eyes, and begins to speak with God. In that quiet space, the noise of the world fades for a moment. The rush of responsibilities slows down, and the heart becomes open to receive something deeper than temporary relief. It begins to receive peace. Peace that settles gently over anxious thoughts. Peace that steadies the rhythm of your breathing. Peace that reminds your soul that God is present even in the middle of uncertainty. Prayer does not always change circumstances immediately, but it always changes the heart of the one who prays. It shifts your perspective. It redirects your focus. Instead of staring endlessly at the size of the problem, your spirit begins to focus on the greatness of God. And when your attention shifts in that way, fear begins to lose its influence. You start to remember moments when God carried you through difficulties before. Situations that once seemed impossible eventually became testimonies of his faithfulness. The same God who guided you through those seasons is still present today. This realization begins to calm the soul. The mind begins to understand that not every problem must be solved in a single moment. Some answers arrive gradually, guided by divine timing rather than human urgency. Prayer creates space for that timing. It allows the heart to rest in the knowledge that God is working even when progress is not immediately visible. It encourages patience where anxiety once demanded instant resolution. As you continue to pray, your inner atmosphere begins to change. The heavy feeling that once sat on your shoulders begins to lift. Your thoughts become clearer. Your emotions begin to stabilize. You may still face responsibilities, decisions, and challenges, but your heart no longer approaches them with the same pressure. Instead, you approach them with a quiet confidence that God's wisdom is guiding your steps. Prayer also reshapes the language of your thoughts. Anxiety often fills the mind with negative predictions, imagining worst-case scenarios and replaying them repeatedly. But prayer introduces a new narrative. It invites hope back into the conversation. Instead of thinking, what if everything goes wrong? The heart begins to wonder, what if God is preparing something better than I expected? Instead of assuming failure, the mind begins to anticipate grace. Instead of expecting disappointment, the spirit begins to trust in divine provision. This transformation does not require extraordinary effort. It simply requires consistent connection with God through prayer. Every time you bring your worries before Him, you are strengthening the pathway through which peace flows into your life. Every prayer becomes a reminder that your burdens are not permanent residents in your heart. They are temporary visitors meant to be released. Over time, this practice reshapes the way you respond to stress. Situations that once triggered immediate anxiety now become invitations to pray. Instead of allowing worry to dominate your thoughts, you instinctively turn to God. This habit creates a rhythm of peace within your daily life. Morning prayers begin to set the tone for the day ahead. Short moments of prayer throughout the day help maintain calmness when responsibilities increase. Evening prayers allow the mind to release the concerns that accumulated during the day. Through this rhythm, anxiety gradually loses its influence. It no longer feels like a constant companion because the presence of God has taken its place. Prayer does not erase every challenge from life, but it transforms the way you walk through those challenges. It replaces fear with faith. It replaces tension with trust. It replaces restless thoughts with steady confidence. And as this transformation deepens, you begin to notice something beautiful happening within your spirit. Your heart becomes lighter. Your mind becomes clearer. Your soul becomes quieter. Where anxiety once created turbulence, peace begins to create stillness. The inner storms that once felt overwhelming begin to calm. This calmness becomes a reflection of God's presence within you. It reminds you that peace is not something you must chase endlessly. It is something you receive when you draw near to God. Even in moments when anxiety tries to return, prayer remains your refuge. You can pause, breathe deeply, and bring every concern back into God's hands. Each prayer becomes another step away from fear and another step toward peace. Each moment of surrender becomes an invitation for God's presence to fill your heart more completely. Each quiet conversation with God becomes a reminder that you were never meant to carry life's burdens alone. And as this truth settles deeper within your spirit, the power of prayer continues to calm your heart, restore your thoughts, and gently release every trace of anxiety that once tried to occupy your soul. There are moments in life when the storm is not outside of you, but within you. Your heart may look calm to everyone around you, but inside there is a struggle. Thoughts collide, emotions rise and fall, and questions keep circling in your mind. In these moments, many people feel powerless, as if the waves of worry are stronger than their ability to stand. But the truth is that God has never called you to live powerless in the middle of life's storms. He has given you something powerful, spiritual authority. Spiritual authority is not loud, and it is not aggressive. It is the quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you belong to. When you understand that you are a child of God, something changes in the way you respond to fear. Instead of feeling controlled by every anxious thought, you begin to realize that your voice in prayer carries weight in the spiritual realm. Many people think authority belongs only to leaders, pastors, or those who appear strong in faith. But spiritual authority is given to every believer who chooses to trust God. It is not based on your personality or background or your past mistakes. It flows from your relationship with the one who holds power over heaven and earth. Think about what happens when someone who has authority enters a chaotic situation. The room changes. The confusion begins to settle. People begin to listen. Authority has a way of restoring order where disorder once existed. In the same way, when you begin to pray with spiritual authority, something begins to shift within your heart. The noise of fear begins to quiet. The pressure of worry begins to loosen. The storm that once seemed uncontrollable begins to lose its intensity. Because spiritual authority reminds every anxious thought that it does not have permission to rule your mind. There are times when fear tries to speak louder than faith. It may whisper that your situation is too complicated, that your problem is too large, or that peace is too far away. But those whispers are not the final voice in your life. When you stand in spiritual authority, you begin to speak truth over those lies. You begin to remind your heart that God is still present. You begin to remind your mind that his power is greater than your fear. You begin to remind your spirit that storms do not last forever. This is the moment when prayer becomes more than comfort, it becomes declaration. Instead of simply asking for peace, you begin to declare peace over your life. Instead of begging fear to leave, you command your mind to align with God's truth. Instead of surrendering to anxiety, you rise with the quiet confidence that God has given you authority over the atmosphere of your heart. Authority in prayer does not require shouting or dramatic words. It often sounds calm, steady, and deeply certain. It comes from a place of trust rather than desperation. When you pray with authority, you are not trying to convince God to act. You are agreeing with the power that he has already placed within you. Imagine standing in the middle of a stormy night where the wind is loud and the rain is falling heavily. For a moment, everything feels chaotic, but then a voice of authority speaks, and suddenly people stop running and begin to listen. That voice carries direction, clarity, and calmness. Your prayers can carry that same authority over the storms in your mind. When anxious thoughts begin to rush through your mind, you can pause and declare peace over your heart. When fear tries to convince you that the future is uncertain, you can remind your spirit that God is guiding every step. When worry tries to take control of your emotions, you can speak words of faith that realign your thoughts with truth. Authority transforms the way you approach prayer. Instead of feeling small and overwhelmed, you begin to pray with the awareness that heaven is listening and heaven responds. You begin to understand that your voice in prayer is not weak. Your voice carries faith. Your voice carries surrender. Your voice carries authority through the name of God. Many people struggle with anxiety because they feel as though their thoughts are controlling them. They feel trapped inside their own minds, unable to silence the constant stream of worries. But spiritual authority reminds you that you are not a prisoner of your thoughts. You have the power to redirect them. You have the authority to challenge them. You have the ability to invite God's peace into every corner of your mind. Think about a garden for a moment. If a garden is left unattended, weeds begin to grow naturally. They spread quickly, taking up space and draining the soil of its strength. But when a gardener steps in with care and attention, the garden begins to change. Weeds are removed, healthy plants are nurtured, and the environment begins to flourish again. Your mind works in a similar way. If fearful thoughts are left unattended, they grow quickly and begin to dominate your thinking. But when you exercise spiritual authority through prayer, you begin to remove those weeds one by one. You begin to plant seeds of truth. You begin to nurture thoughts of faith. You begin to cultivate an atmosphere of peace within your mind. This process does not happen through force, but through consistency. Every time you choose to pray instead of panic, you are exercising spiritual authority. Every time you speak truth instead of repeating fear, you are strengthening your spirit. And over time, something beautiful begins to happen. The thoughts that once overwhelmed you begin to lose their influence. The fears that once seemed powerful begin to appear smaller. The anxiety that once filled your heart begins to fade. Not because life suddenly became perfect, but because your spirit learned to stand in the authority God has given you. There is also something deeply calming about realizing that authority does not mean you must control everything. Authority simply means you trust the one who is in control. When you pray with authority, you are not trying to force outcomes. You are aligning your heart with God's wisdom. You are declaring that no matter what happens around you, God's presence remains constant. This awareness creates a deep sense of peace within the soul. You begin to understand that even when situations feel uncertain, your foundation remains secure. God's promises remain steady. His presence remains near. And because of that, your heart can remain calm even in moments that once felt overwhelming. As you listen to these words right now, take a moment to reflect honestly on your own heart. Every person faces storms at different times in life. Some storms are loud and visible, while others are quiet battles that happen within the mind. Maybe your storm is a decision you have been struggling to make. Maybe it is a situation that feels outside your control. Maybe it is a fear about the future that keeps returning to your thoughts. But here is the question I want you to think about for a moment. What storm in your life right now needs you to rise in spiritual authority and speak peace over it? Take a moment to reflect on that question. Think about the area of your life where anxiety has been trying to take control. Think about the place where fear has been whispering the loudest. Now I want you to do something powerful. I want you to go to the comments and share your answer. What storm are you believing God to calm in your life right now? Write it in the comments as a declaration of faith. When you put it into words, you are not just sharing a problem, you are inviting God's authority into that situation. And as you write it, remember that you are not alone. There are many others who are listening and praying alongside you. Your comment may encourage someone else who is facing a similar struggle. Your honesty may become a moment of hope for someone who thought they were the only one experiencing that storm. There is something powerful about a community of faith standing together, each person declaring peace over their lives and trusting God to bring calm where chaos once lived. Because when believers begin to stand in spiritual authority together, something shifts in the atmosphere. Fear begins to lose its grip. Hope begins to rise. Faith begins to grow stronger. Your storm does not define you. Your anxiety does not control you. And your future is not determined by the fears that once filled your mind. You have been given the authority to invite God's peace into your life through prayer. You have been given the power to speak truth over your thoughts and calm over your emotions. And every time you exercise that authority, your heart becomes steadier, your mind becomes quieter, and the storms within your spirit begin to settle under the presence of God. There are seasons in life when the mind feels crowded with questions. You may wake up in the morning already thinking about what could go wrong. Your thoughts begin to move quickly from one concern to another, and before the day has even started, your heart feels heavy. Many people experience this quiet pressure, the kind that sits in the background of their thoughts and refuses to slow down. It is not always loud, but it is persistent. And in those moments, the mind begins searching for control. The human mind naturally wants certainty. It wants clear answers, visible solutions, and predictable outcomes. When those things are missing, the mind begins to work overtime trying to fill in the gaps. It imagines scenarios, anticipates problems, and attempts to prepare for every possible outcome. But the more the mind tries to control what it cannot see, the more overwhelmed it becomes. This is where trusting God becomes essential. Trusting God does not mean you suddenly understand every detail of your life. It does not mean every question immediately receives an answer. Trust means choosing to believe that even when your mind feels overwhelmed, God's wisdom is still guiding your path. It means allowing your heart to rest in the assurance that God sees what you cannot yet see. When the mind becomes overwhelmed, it often tries to carry responsibilities that belong to God. It tries to predict the future, solve problems that have not yet happened, and protect itself from possibilities that may never occur. Over time, this constant mental activity creates exhaustion within the soul. But God never intended for your mind to carry that kind of weight. Your mind was created to think, reflect, and learn, but it was never designed to hold the entire future on its shoulders. That responsibility belongs to God alone. When you begin to understand this truth, something begins to shift within your heart. The pressure to control every outcome slowly begins to loosen. Imagine walking through a thick fog where you can only see a few steps ahead. At first, it feels uncomfortable because your mind wants to see the entire path clearly. But as you continue walking, you realize that even though the fog remains, each step reveals just enough ground for the next movement forward. Trusting God often feels like walking through that fog. You may not see the entire journey ahead, but God always reveals enough for the next step. When the mind is overwhelmed, it often becomes restless. Thoughts repeat themselves in cycles, and the same worries appear again and again. But when trust begins to grow in your heart, those cycles begin to break. Instead of asking the same anxious questions repeatedly, your mind begins to rest in the knowledge that God is already aware of every detail. You begin to understand that the future is not an empty space filled with uncertainty. It is a place where God's presence already exists. This realization changes the way you approach your thoughts. Instead of chasing every worry, you begin to pause and breathe. You remind yourself that God's plans are not limited by your understanding. You release the need to figure everything out immediately. Trust creates room for peace. Peace begins to settle gently into your thoughts. Your breathing slows. Your mind begins to soften its grip on every unanswered question. The urgency that once filled your thoughts begins to fade. Many people believe that trust must come after clarity, but spiritual trust often begins before clarity arrives. It begins with a simple decision in the heart to believe that God is faithful even when the path ahead feels uncertain. Think about a child holding the hand of a parent while crossing a busy street. The child does not analyze traffic patterns or calculate the safest route. The child trusts the parent guiding them across. That trust creates calmness in the child's heart. In the same way, trusting God allows your spirit to rest even when your mind does not have every answer. When your thoughts begin to overwhelm you, it is often helpful to pause and remember the times God has guided you before. There have been moments in your life when you faced uncertainty, yet somehow things worked out in ways you could not have predicted. Situations that once felt confusing eventually became clearer. Problems that once felt overwhelming eventually found resolution. Paths that once seemed impossible eventually opened. Those moments were not accidents. They were reminders of God's faithfulness. And the same faithfulness that carried you through those seasons remains present in your life today. The mind becomes overwhelmed when it forgets this history of grace. But when you intentionally remember God's past faithfulness, your perspective begins to shift. You realize that the same God who guided you yesterday is still guiding you today. This realization begins to calm the storm within your thoughts. Your mind starts to release its grip on fear. Your heart begins to feel steadier. The future no longer feels like a dark unknown, but a journey that God is walking with you step by step. Trust also teaches the mind to rest in God's timing. One of the reasons people feel overwhelmed is because they want answers immediately. They want solutions today for problems that may unfold over time. But God's wisdom operates on a different timeline. Sometimes the answers you are seeking require growth, preparation, or circumstances aligning in ways you cannot yet see. Trusting God means believing that His timing is not delayed, it is intentional. When you embrace this truth, your mind begins to relax. You stop rushing the process. You stop forcing answers before they are ready to appear. Instead, you allow life to unfold with patience and faith. This patience creates space for calmness within your spirit. Instead of living with constant mental pressure, you begin to experience moments of quiet clarity. Your thoughts become more focused. Your decisions become more thoughtful. Your emotions become steadier. Trust in God transforms the inner atmosphere of your life. Even when challenges appear, you no longer approach them with the same fear. You begin to face them with confidence that God's wisdom is present in every situation. Your mind begins to understand that being overwhelmed is not a permanent state. It is simply a signal that your heart needs to return to trust. Every time you choose to trust God instead of surrendering to worry, you are retraining your mind to rest. You are teaching your thoughts to release what they cannot control and embrace the peace that God offers. Over time, this practice becomes natural. When overwhelming thoughts begin to appear, you recognize them quickly. Instead of allowing them to dominate your mind, you gently redirect your attention toward God's promises. You remind yourself that the future is not your burden to carry. You remind yourself that God's wisdom is greater than your understanding. You remind yourself that peace becomes possible when trust takes the place of fear. As you listen right now, I want you to take a quiet moment and reflect on your own thoughts. Everyone experiences seasons when their mind feels overwhelmed. Sometimes it is because of responsibilities, sometimes because of uncertainty, and sometimes because of fears that have been quietly building over time. Think honestly about your heart right now. What thought or situation has been overwhelming your mind the most lately? Is it a decision you need to make? Is it a concern about the future? Is it something from the past that keeps returning to your thoughts? Take a moment and reflect on that question. Now, I want you to do something meaningful. Go to the comments and write your answer. What is the one thing you are choosing to trust God with today? Write it in the comments as a declaration of faith. When you put those words into writing, you are not just sharing a concern, you are releasing it into God's hands. Your comment may also encourage someone else who is listening right now. Someone else may read your words and realize they are not alone in their struggles. Your honesty may become a reminder that many people are learning to trust God through similar situations. This moment of shared faith creates a powerful sense of community. People from different places and different stories can come together in one purpose, choosing trust over fear. And every time you choose trust, your mind becomes a little quieter. Your heart becomes a little lighter. Your spirit becomes a little steadier. The overwhelming thoughts that once filled your mind begin to lose their power, and the calm presence of God begins to gently fill the space where worry once lived. There are moments in life when the mind becomes a place of constant conversation. Thoughts move quickly, one after another, sometimes so fast that it feels impossible to quiet them. A memory may appear, then a worry about the future, then a question about something that has not even happened yet. Before long, the heart begins to feel restless because the mind has filled itself with voices that create uncertainty and tension. What many people do not realize is that the words spoken inside the mind have tremendous influence over the condition of the heart. Every thought carries direction. Every belief shapes emotion. And every word you repeat in your mind begins to build the atmosphere of your inner life. If the mind repeats fear, the heart begins to feel afraid. If the mind repeats doubt, the spirit begins to feel weak. If the mind constantly imagines negative outcomes, anxiety begins to grow stronger. But the opposite is also true. When the mind begins to speak God's promises, something different begins to happen. The atmosphere within the heart begins to change. Fear begins to loosen its grip. Hope begins to rise quietly. Peace begins to settle into the spaces where worry once lived. Speaking God's promises over your heart and thoughts is not merely positive thinking. It is aligning your mind with truth that is greater than your circumstances. God's promises carry authority because they come from the one who sees beyond time and understands every detail of your life. Many people underestimate the power of what they say to themselves throughout the day. Words spoken repeatedly become beliefs, and beliefs begin to shape the direction of your thoughts. This is why it is so important to allow God's promises to become the language of your mind. Imagine your mind as a quiet room where different voices are speaking. One voice may be fear, reminding you of past disappointments. Another voice may be doubt, questioning whether things will ever improve. Another voice may be worry, repeating the same concerns again and again. But when you begin to speak God's promises over your life, a new voice enters that room. It is the voice of truth, and truth has a way of bringing calmness to confusion. When you remind your heart that God is faithful, your spirit begins to feel steadier. When you declare that God is guiding your steps, your thoughts begin to feel more secure. When you speak promises of peace and protection, your mind begins to release the tension it was holding. This practice is especially powerful during moments when anxiety tries to take control of your thinking. Anxiety thrives on repetition. It repeats the same worries again and again until they begin to feel real. But speaking God's promises interrupts that cycle. Instead of repeating fear, you begin repeating truth. Instead of imagining failure, you begin declaring faith. Instead of focusing on uncertainty, you begin reminding your heart of God's presence. This shift may seem small at first, but its impact grows with consistency. Each time you speak God's promises, you are strengthening a pathway of peace within your mind. Over time, your thoughts begin to follow that pathway naturally. Think about the way water flows through the land. When water travels the same path repeatedly, it gradually creates a stream. That stream becomes deeper and more defined with time. Eventually, it becomes the natural direction for the water to travel. Your thoughts work in a similar way. If your mind constantly flows toward worry, anxiety becomes the natural response. But when your thoughts begin flowing toward God's promises, peace becomes the new direction for your mind. This is why speaking God's promises is so important. It trains your mind to return to truth instead of fear. Sometimes this practice happens quietly. You may simply remind yourself that God is with you. You may whisper a promise of peace during a moment of stress. You may repeat words of faith when uncertainty tries to fill your thoughts. Those moments may seem simple, but they carry deep spiritual significance. They are moments when you choose to let God's truth shape your thinking. Over time, your heart begins to trust those promises more deeply. You begin to realize that God's words are not distant ideas, but living truths that speak directly into your life. They remind you that you are not forgotten, not alone, and not without guidance. Even when circumstances appear complicated, God's promises remain steady. When fear tries to convince you that everything is uncertain, God's promises remind you that His plans are secure. When worry tries to tell you that you must solve every problem immediately, God's promises remind you that His wisdom is already working behind the scenes. These promises act like anchors for the soul. An anchor does not remove the waves from the ocean, but it prevents the ship from drifting away. In the same way, God's promises do not erase every challenge in life, but they keep your heart steady in the middle of uncertainty. They remind your mind where to rest. They remind your spirit what to believe. They remind your heart that peace is still possible even when circumstances are still unfolding. One of the most beautiful things about speaking God's promises is that it invites His presence into your daily thoughts. Instead of allowing your mind to wander through endless worries, you begin to fill it with words that reflect God's character, words of faith, words of hope, words of trust. As these words become part of your thinking, your emotional world begins to change. The heaviness that once followed you begins to lift. The pressure that once filled your chest begins to soften. Your heart begins to breathe again. You begin to experience moments of calm, even in situations that once triggered anxiety. Not because the situation has disappeared, but because your perspective has shifted. Instead of focusing on the size of the problem, your mind begins to focus on the greatness of God. This focus changes everything, because when your thoughts center on God's promises, fear begins to lose its authority, doubt begins to fade, worry begins to loosen its grip, and peace quietly begins to grow. Speaking God's promises also strengthens your spiritual awareness. You begin to recognize when your thoughts are moving in the wrong direction. Instead of allowing negative patterns to continue, you gently redirect them. You remind yourself that God's peace is available. You remind yourself that His presence is near. You remind yourself that every challenge is temporary, but His promises remain constant. This awareness creates a new rhythm within your life. Your thoughts become more intentional. Your responses become more thoughtful. Your heart becomes more grounded in faith. And slowly, the atmosphere of your mind begins to change. Where worry once dominated, calmness begins to grow. Where fear once repeated itself endlessly, hope begins to speak louder. Where uncertainty once filled your thoughts, trust begins to settle. This transformation does not happen through pressure or perfection. It happens through simple, consistent moments of truth spoken over your life. Each time you speak God's promises, you are reminding your spirit of who God is. You are reminding your heart that his love is constant. You are reminding your mind that his peace is stronger than anxiety. And as these reminders continue day after day, they begin to reshape the way you experience life. Your heart becomes less reactive to fear. Your mind becomes less vulnerable to worry. Your spirit becomes more confident in God's presence. This calm confidence is not something the world can easily explain. It is the result of a mind that has learned to rest in God's promises rather than chase every anxious thought. When people encounter someone who lives with this kind of peace, they often notice something different. There is a steadiness in their voice, a calmness in their decisions, a quiet strength in the way they respond to challenges. That steadiness comes from a heart that has learned to speak truth over fear. And every time you choose to speak God's promises over your thoughts, you are strengthening that same peace within your own life. Your mind becomes a place where faith grows instead of fear. Your heart becomes a place where hope lives instead of anxiety. Your spirit becomes a place where God's presence can settle gently, bringing calmness and reassurance into every corner of your inner world. There are moments when the soul becomes tired in ways that are difficult to explain. It may not be physical exhaustion alone, but a deeper weariness that comes from carrying too many thoughts, too many worries, and too many unanswered questions. The mind tries to keep moving forward, but the heart quietly longs for rest. In these moments, what the spirit truly needs is not more effort or more striving. What the spirit needs is the presence of God. The presence of God has a unique ability to calm the human spirit. It does not arrive with pressure or urgency. It comes gently, quietly, and steadily. When the presence of God fills a moment, something within the heart begins to soften. The tension that once filled the mind begins to loosen, and the soul begins to experience a kind of rest that cannot be created through human effort alone. Many people search for peace by trying to fix every problem around them. They believe that once the circumstances improve, then the heart will finally feel calm. But the peace that comes from God works differently. It does not wait for every problem to disappear before it enters your life. Instead, it arrives in the middle of your circumstances and begins to calm your spirit from the inside. When you allow the presence of God to enter your life, you are inviting a kind of stillness that reaches deeper than emotions. It touches the center of your soul. It reminds your heart that you are not alone in the journey you are walking. Sometimes people imagine the presence of God as something distant or difficult to experience, but in truth, it is closer than most people realize. The presence of God often appears in quiet moments, moments when the noise of the world fades and the heart becomes open. It may happen during prayer when you pause and breathe slowly. It may happen during a moment of reflection when you remember God's faithfulness in your life. It may happen during a quiet evening when your mind begins to settle after a long day. In those moments, the spirit becomes aware of something peaceful, something steady, something deeply comforting. That awareness is the presence of God. The presence of God does not force itself into your life. It waits for an invitation. When you take time to slow down and acknowledge God, you are opening the door for his peace to enter your heart. One of the reasons people struggle to feel calm is because life moves so quickly. Responsibilities fill every hour, thoughts race from one task to another, and the mind rarely stops long enough to breathe. But the presence of God thrives in moments of stillness. When you pause and allow your heart to become quiet, you begin to notice God in ways that were previously hidden beneath the noise of everyday life. Your breathing becomes deeper. Your thoughts begin to slow. Your emotions begin to